Sometimes our lives begin to pile up things. And as you're turning there to 2 Kings 4, or if you're using the YouVersion Bible app, you can go to the Live Events tab on the left, then click on Search for Live Events and find this morning's notes. Or if you're using the Bible in the seat in front of you, I think the page number is 309. You can go there and find that as well. But sometimes things pile up, and when it rains, it pours, that kind of thing, that something overwhelming happens, and then something else by itself would be overwhelming. It also happens, and then a third thing drops out, and things just begin snowballing at different times of your life. There was a period like that when we were about to have our first child. Katie was pregnant with Caleb. He was due mid to late January in there. I had just started a new job at that point. I was 6 months into this new job. I had my first major event at this new job at this church was coming up. It was about 3 weeks after Caleb was supposed to be born. It was a major event, 200 or 300 people trying to organize all the moving pieces. And then he was going to be born in the midst of that. And then on top of that, it was my last semester of seminary. And for some reason, I decided to not save my easy classes till last. And there was a Greek class in there, but the one that was eating my lunch, there at seminary, you have to take several preaching classes. And at preaching class, you think, okay, you get to study, great preachers, that's great, and that part's cool. But the core of that class, it's become notorious for this, is you have to preach to the class a particular sermon, and if you are under or over the time limit by more than 60 seconds, you get deducted. And on top of that, the second you get done preaching, you sit down in the chair, and then everybody else in the class who's in the same boat as you, has the same experience as you, has studied the same as you, gets to tell you everything you did wrong. And then when they get done telling you about all the stuff you did wrong, the professor gets up in front of everybody and tells everybody what you did wrong. And then at the end of class, they give you a DVD to go home and watch so you can write a paper about all the stuff you did wrong. And so it is brutal to do that. And so Caleb was due. I had that major event coming up, and about 10 days after Caleb was due, I had my first time to preach in that class. And so all of this is happening. I'm thinking, this is crazy. This is overwhelming. And I think it was the Friday before Caleb was due. Katie ran up to the store for an errand, which I know you're thinking I'm a terrible husband letting my wife, who's going to give birth in 2 days, go up to the store. But I can't. I thought and couldn't remember why she had gone. But she had gone for some reason to the store. And I was at home. And I went out to the garage to get something. And I wasn't wearing shoes, which in hindsight, it was a terrible decision. I'd gone out to the garage to get something, was coming back in the house. And I don't know how your garage floors are, but it's usually just the concrete. And so I'm in my socks, and I slip as I'm coming back in the house. And as I slip, I go to catch myself on the door frame, but my hand doesn't come up all the way, and it slams into the door frame. And that doesn't really hurt that bad, but I can't move it, and it's just kind of flopping around. But then all of a sudden I get really nauseous, and I run to the bathroom, and about that time Katie gets home, and she comes back there trying to find me, and she sees me, looking like I'm going to throw up, and she's about to give birth, and she doesn't want to catch something if I've got something, so she walks in, sees me, whoa, takes a step back, and I said, I don't know, something happened, I hit my hand, and it's swelling up and not moving, so I think something's wrong, we need to go to the hospital. And so we went to the hospital, they x-rayed it, and my hand was broken. And it was this bone right here. It's called a boxer's break. So I like to tell people, have you ever I broke my hand. It was a boxer's break, and I broke it by slipping in the garage and hitting it on the wall. But I don't say that part. But it was a weird break. It was like a corkscrew break. And so, this is like Friday night. She's due on Sunday. And so this is a whole thing, and they say you need to make an appointment at the orthopedist, and, that they can figure out what to do. And so we said, okay, fine. If she doesn't have the baby, then we'll go and we'll do that. And so Sunday comes, no baby. We go to the doctor on Monday. They also do an x-ray. They say, sure enough, it's broken. I said, I could have told you that and saved some money. But they say, we need to schedule surgery to fix this thing. We're going to open it up and put some screws in there, and we're going to fix it. And I said, okay, fine, we'll schedule it. But if we have the baby before then we're just going to not do the surgery, and we're going to have to go and do what we need to do. Because the thing was, if they waited too long and it started to heal, they would have to re-break it in order to do surgery on it. And I didn't want any part of that business. And so the week goes, and Caleb is just not wanting to come. I mean, he is having a good time being inside Mommy's tummy. And so we get to Friday, go and have the surgery. I don't remember much about that day. I do remember that evening waking up and Katie asking me if I wanted to take the medicine that they gave me. They give you the big pills. And I said no, because if I took that, I wouldn't be able to drive her to the doctor if she went into labor because her doctor was 45 minutes away. And so that day passes. Saturday comes. She's starting to have some labor pains. And now remember, I'm still thinking, going through my head, okay, I've got a broken hand, about to have a baby, I've got that major event in a few weeks, I've got to preach, and at this point, I've got to preach this next Wednesday for class, or this next Thursday for class, and then she gets labor pains on that Saturday. And so, I'm getting anxious, and she's really getting anxious because, she's having a baby. I'm not at least having the baby. That's, praise Jesus. And so he wasn't ready to come on that Saturday, but we go Sunday. Caleb is born after a long day of labor for Katie. A lot longer for her than it was for me. And we're there. So he's born, and everything's great, even though in all of our baby pictures from those days in the hospital, I've got a big old thing on my hand. I'm holding him, and my hand's in this weird position, and because I just had surgery and holding him, and at least I couldn't change diapers until they got that thing off because we didn't want to get, baby stuff on my hand because we couldn't, wash the cast. That would be gross, and so at least I didn't, my first child, all of the diapers got to be changed by most other people. And so there is a miracle in the mess sometimes. And so that happens. We get out of the hospital Wednesday evening, but we get home Wednesday evening, and I'm preaching the next day, Thursday, and I haven't done anything on my sermon to do for class. And so I stay up all night, do my preparation, go in Thursday morning, preach the thing, and sit down, and I can't remember anything that they said about how terrible it was. Watching it back on the DVD a few days later, I was thinking, man, I didn't even know I said that stuff. That's pretty great. No, I said, that's awful. I had like a 10-page paper about how bad it was. And so, stuff piled up, but as you're going through things that pile up and you look at it and you say, man, there's no way out. How am I going to get through this? One more thing happened. That's awful. Or that case, I think, oh, great, I broke my hand. I did call people from the hospital that night when I broke my hand, and I said, hey, we're in the hospital, but it's for me, not her. And so that was fun, at least in the midst of the pain. And so when things pile up, usually, though, we begin to think about the individual situations. In that case, in that day, I thought about all of those little things and was thinking about, I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And when I get back, I've got to do 15 different other things. And we think about the individual things we're going through, and oftentimes we forget about God's provision, God's faithfulness in the midst of the pile up. But when we forget about God's faithfulness, it leads us to fear. When there's a lack of faithfulness, there is a void that is filled by fear. And so we need to focus on God's faithfulness. And that's what we're going to see today in 2 Kings chapter 4. We come upon Elisha, who is the prophet now in the nation of Israel. And his previous boss, the prophet before him, was a guy named Elijah. He was a great prophet. He did things like stop the rain for 3.5 years and then bring it back. He called fire down from heaven in front of the entire nation. Fire that was so hot, it ate up rocks and dirt. He did things for God that were fantastic. And then he goes into heaven without dying, and Elisha comes on the scene. He's the new guy. He's the new head of the prophets. He's the new spokesman for God to the people. And he's done a couple of things at this point. He has done a few small things and then one major thing. He's coming off a big win for God, for the people. And we get to 2 Kings 4, And we see some minute details compared to the larger scale miracles. Look at 2 Kings 4, verse 1. It says, "Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves.'" Now, it says that the sons of the prophets, the wife of one of the sons of the prophets. Now, that wasn't literally children of prophets. You know, they had their little children of prophets club. That's not what this is. This was a group of people, or even a social class of the day that we learn not just here, but other places throughout the Old Testament. There was more than just one prophet at a time. There was more than just 2 prophets at a time. There was a group of them. And later on, they even get prophet training centers, prophet schools spread out throughout the nation in various cities. And these sons of the prophet, that title, these are kind of the precursors to the prophet schools that come later. And so you have these prophets, these sons of prophets, this group of people who are prophets, and Elisha is their leader. He is the boss. He is the main prophet. And so the wife of one of the sons of prophet who has just died, and so she is in great grief, having her husband just die, and then she has 2 smaller children, and they are also in great grief, having to deal with the loss of their father. And in the midst of that, there's this overwhelming debt that they owe. And it's not just a little bit of debt. I mean, they're struggling financially a great deal. Not just the point of they have to decide whether to get rid of the Disney Channel or the sports channels. They are having to get rid of everything. They are in such deep debt. And the man they owe the money to is going to come and kidnap her children and make them slaves. But there are no authorities to call. There's no law protecting forced slavery from happening. This was a common practice of the day. This was a typical thing that would happen, that if you owed a great deal of money and could not pay it back, the one you owed the money to could come and either make you or someone from your family a slave until the money was paid back with interest. And so this man is owed a great money to, and he's probably come and already paid this woman and her children several visits, coming and letting them know how much they owe. And quite possibly, as we're going to see later, he begins to take some of their stuff to recoup some of the debt, begins to take some of her possessions to sell off to recover some of what she owes. And he finally comes, all her stuff is gone, and he tells her, the next time I come back to collect, if you don't have that money, I'm taking your kids, and they will be my slaves until you can pay it back. And so this woman is desperate now. She's at the end of her rope. She has no other options, and so she thinks, well, then I will go and appeal to God. Once she finally has no options left, she goes to God's man Elisha and asks for help. Look at verse 2. And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house?" And she said, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." And so this woman has gone to Elisha, and throughout 2 Kings, looking at the ministry of Elisha, his ministry is characterized by a lot of individual help, helping out individuals in their own specific lives. And so he wants to help this woman. She comes and asks for help, and he wants to help her. Her husband was one of Elisha's ministers, one of the guys who helped him. So beyond the typical human compassion that he feels for this woman in need, there's a sense of loyalty there also. Her dead husband was one of his helpers, and so he wants to help this woman in return. But what I find interesting, as I alluded to a moment ago, this woman appeals to Elisha now. Now that there's no options left, now that it's the end of everything she could have done, she comes and asks for help. She didn't come earlier. Elisha was not approached when the debt was beginning, before it got out of hand. On the first visit of the man they owed money to, she didn't go to Elisha. She didn't go before all of this happened. She came when there was no option left, once every other option had been exhausted. And now, how often in reality, if we were truly honest with ourselves, is this the case with us? You know, how much pain and anxiety do we go through that we could have avoided if we would have gone to God much sooner than we end up doing? You know, there's an old song, a very old song. Some of you will remember it, and it says, "Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear, all because we do not carry everything to God in prayer." That when we don't take it to God in prayer, when we don't give our burdens, our anxieties, our problems, our stress to God, we're holding on to them when they were designed to only be handled by someone with God's power. We're trying to handle them in our own strength, and we're coming up short, coming up wanting. But listen again to what Elisha says. She comes to him and says, "I desperately need help." And he says, "What do you want me to do for you? What can I do for you?" He asks her what she wants from him. And then he immediately asks her what she already has. He says, "What is in your house?" Or, as you know, the title for this message, he asks her, "What is in your pantry? What do you already have? You want something from me? Tell me what you already have." She asks Elisha to do something for her, but he asks her, "What kind of ingredients do you have in your pantry?" She needed to take inventory. You know, what in her opinion, you know, knowing that she doesn't have very much, if she was to take inventory, it would not take very long. But we often need to take inventory of our own lives. We need to take inventory of what we have, what God has already given to us. I can remember a time when we moved into our first house. We moved into our first house. We had lived in several places previous, and we were finally moving into a house. And so we, had gathered up all the things we had from our previous places we lived, the food, the canned goods, the bowls and the plates and the wedding china that you never use. We took it all, and we took it to the new house, and we put it in. And then, a year or so went by, and we realized we don't really know what's in the pantry. We've got stuff on the front of the pantry that we use, but there's stuff in the back that we have no idea what it is or how long it's been there. And so we set about to kind of clean out the pantry. And so we were going to take stuff down and put it in two piles, the keep pile and the gross pile. I can't believe it's in my pantry pile. And so we began to put stuff out and pull it out, the cereal and the cans are what's interesting. If you ever go through the cans in your pantry, you will be amazed sometimes what you have in there. And so we're taking it out, we're putting it out, and some things I'm slipping into the gross pile just because. And as we do, we're looking at all the dates on the cans. And we realize, we've been given, food over the years and up to this point, and some people have given us stuff, and it was very kind and generous. And then we come across, 3 or 4 cans that we realize they expired before we even got married. How did we get these things in here? Not only is it stuff we probably wouldn't eat in the first place, they expired before we even met each other. I don't know what is going on with these green beans here. I do not want to open that can to see what else is growing in there. We got mutant green beans. And so we take that can immediately out to the curb. But and then when you do that, you clear everything out. And then you begin to put stuff back in the pantry. It's when you're putting it back in, you begin to remember later on what you already have. Because in cleaning out your pantry, you're kind of doing an inventory of what you have. So that later on when you're thinking, okay, we want to have this for dinner and we got to cook it. Hey, you know what? I've got such and such in the pantry. We can utilize that. Even though that's 3 or 4 cans back, we can use that one. It helps you understand what you have in there to use for ingredients down the road. Sometimes in our own personal lives, we need to take inventory of what we already have to see what God is going to use down the road. This woman, she doesn't think she has anything. She says, all I have is a little jar of oil. And the little jar she's talking about, she's not talking about some of those big 3-foot jugs that they had back then for jars. The way this is phrased, she's talking about a little bitty serving jar, a little pouring jar, and it is not even full all the way. It's a partially full serving jar of oil. That's all she has in her house. Everything else is gone. All the furniture, all the other food, all the dishes, everything is gone except that little thing. But she forgets to acknowledge she does have children. She still has a house, and she has that small jar of oil. But she sees her situation as hopeless. She sees her possessions as empty. She thought that there was no way out. All she had was that one little jar of oil that she could use for food, or she could use for lamps to light the house. But the thing about using that oil for food, she didn't have any flour, so she couldn't make bread. And they're not going to drink the oil. That's not very tasty. And so they just have this unusable little jar of oil. She doesn't think she has very much. But the thing is, when God interjects himself into our seemingly empty pantry, we have all the necessary ingredients for a miracle. When God interjects himself into our seemingly empty pantry, we have all the necessary ingredients for a miracle. You can take a personal inventory and in a moment of great anxiety or discouragement, think about what you have, what you have, and you may not think that you have much reason to be thankful for, but when you double check and see what's really in your house, what's really in your pantry, what's really in your life, things begin to shift. Things begin to change because you may have forgotten to include something in your inventory of your life. Because God's presence and power mixed with any ingredient that you have in your life is more than enough to accomplish the fantastical, the wonderful, the miraculous. So check your pantry. Are you sure that you only have what you think you only have? So this mother has told Elisha that all she has in her pantry is one single little bitty jar of oil. Verse 3. Then he said, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few." So Elisha's response to hearing about the empty shelves in this woman's house is very interesting. He tells her to go and borrow a bunch of vessels. Now, you notice he uses that word vessels. He didn't say jars. He didn't say go get a bunch of other jars like the jar you already have. He tells her to go and get vessels, a bunch of empty containers, anything that can contain something and has an opening. Go and grab it. Borrow it from anybody. Borrow it. You see people on the street. Say, hey, can I borrow your purse? Take stuff out, and I'll bring it back. I just need it for a minute. He tells her to go to everywhere. All of her neighbors, if they have any sort of empty container, she's supposed to ask them for it. At this point, he hasn't told her what she's going to use those things for. He doesn't give her a specific amount to go and grab. He didn't say go grab 10. He just says go and grab containers and not a few of them. Get as many as you can possibly have. That's the implication. This isn't the time for shame. This isn't the time for embarrassment. All of her neighbors undoubtedly would have known about her financial situation as they have seen the creditors walk into her house empty-handed and walk out with a couch. They know what's going on. They could probably hear the yelling and the screaming that's going on in the house from these guys, and they know her situation. This isn't a time for her to be worried about what they think about her. Elisha's words to her are, go to all of your neighbors, doesn't matter what they think about you, and ask them for some containers. They didn't have a container store. There's not a Walmart here. She's supposed to go around and ask them for stuff. And we're going to find out in a moment that it's really up to this woman's faith and determination and perseverance as to how many containers she actually comes up with. You see, however many vessels she's going to find out, however many vessels that she finds will be exactly how much of the miracle of God she gets to experience. And then Elisha tells her in the next verse what she's supposed to do with these containers. Verse 4, he says, "Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all these vessels. And when one is full, set it aside." So after she collected everything that she was to go into her house with her sons and shut the door of the house behind her. She was supposed to take her little pouring jar of oil and start pouring it into the empty containers that she had collected. But then Elisha does something unique in his description to this woman. Usually these prophet guys, they will say, do this, and they don't give them the end of the story. But Elisha tells her, he says, pour into all these vessels. That's a key word, all these vessels. And then he says, when one is full, set it aside. So he gives her an inkling of what's to come. He tells her, you're going to be able to pour into every single one of those containers, and you're going to start filling them up to the brim. And so she's undoubtedly getting a little excited. Her eyes get a little widened when she hears those words. Even though this is an obscure miracle that Elisha's talking about, filling jars with oil, that's not calling fire down from heaven, but, that's cool, Elisha. I'm not going to complain. She says, she's thinking that, this would be cool nonetheless to see what God can do, to get a firsthand experience, not just hear other people's stories, but get to see God do something in my empty house. And he tells her, when those vessels start filling up, you need to be quick because you are going to have to switch them out and pour into the next one and then pour into the next one. But then he kind of gives her an idea of how she is to pour, the manner in which. Look at verse 5. So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons, and as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. Now, what's key in this, she has just made a very public display, going house to house, asking for vessels, asking for containers. But Elisha's word to her is, shut the door. Close out the outside world. This miracle, this experience with God is just to be between the woman, her sons, and God. This isn't for anyone else to see. This isn't for anyone else to observe. All the other distractions, the thought of the creditor coming up the walkway, the thought of neighbors walking by and looking in, none of that is supposed to matter. He says, shut the door so nobody can see, so nobody can bother you or distract you, and you get to doing what God has for you to do. They were supposed to see God do a great work in the pouring of this oil, and nothing else was supposed to distract them from this. Undoubtedly later, when it was all over, she would go around and kind of shout it from the rooftops, you won't believe what God did in my house, kind of thing. But in that moment, there's supposed to be none of that. Sometimes when you need something from God, or you need to refocus, or you need to spend that time with God, you need to have some dedicated time. You have that piling up of stuff, and you really need to seek God's faithfulness. Sometimes we need to shut the door, shut everything else out, and have a time between just God and you. Because, this woman, as she poured and her sons brought the containers to her with their doors closed, in that moment, as she's seeing the oil pour and pour and pour, there's no desperation, there's no shame, there's no embarrassment from other people hearing about her situation. There is only the unique experience that they're having with God in that moment. Sometimes we've got to shut the door, shut out the distractions, shut out the noise, and just get with God. Back when I was a student minister, every summer we would hire interns. We would bring in college students who would, work for free, and so it was fantastic because we didn't pay them, and we worked them to the bone. They would usually get us to sign off on some kind of service hours or something, but this one particular summer that I remember, we ridiculously hired 8 of them. 8 college kids in one confined space for 3 months is a lot of time and a lot of noise. It's crazy. I don't recommend it. But we did it. They did a lot of work. We had a lot of assignments for them to do. And usually they would make their base of operations in my office. And so it became difficult sometimes to get some stuff done, but they were there, and it was part of investing in their lives and seeing stuff done. But there was a particular time that I was going to have to be out of the office for a few days. And I had given them some assignments. There were some videos they needed to film and edit and process, and there was some preparation they needed to do for camp coming up and some things like that. And so I'd given them these assignments, and I left. But one of the days I was gone, my phone began to just blow up. I got text message after text message from all 8 of them. And then I get this email from our financial secretary. And now you got to understand, the financial secretary's office was literally 3 feet away from where the door to my office was. And I get this email from the financial secretary, and it's written in the form of like an official memo that essentially she said in the email, I have fired all of your interns because it is too noisy in the office. And I think, well, okay, just calm down and breathe for a second. Because I had a lot of stuff that they needed to do and get done, and it had to be done by the time I got back, or we wouldn't be able to pull off what we needed to pull off for camp and whatnot. And so I immediately go and call her boss, and I talked to him for a minute about the situation. And yes, the interns were being noisy. The cat's away, the mice will play, and stuff was going crazy. And there were water guns that were shot, and airsoft guns that were shot, and Nerf guns that were shot. And the office became a battleground for rubber band wars. And it really got out of hand. I mean, it was a McDonald's playground for 20-year-olds. It was nuts. And so I talked to him on the phone for a little while, and we decided, okay, this is what's going to happen. They were going to have to go down and do some work some other places. If they needed to come to the office, they had to. There was stuff in the office they had to do. And so what we decided is that the secretary, she would just, she was of the type, she was very efficient. She got a lot of stuff done, but it had to be complete silence to get stuff done. There could be no noise whatsoever, or, it was pandemonium in her mind. And so what we decided is she would just shut the door. In the office, there were these, massive, heavy doors. And if you shut it, it blocked out almost all of the noise. And so that was a solution. It wasn't kick the interns out. It wasn't fire them. It wasn't lock the doors, change the lock so they don't have keys to get in. It was just shut the door, the noise was blocked, and work could be done. That's what we got to do sometimes, is we need to get time alone with God and just shut the door when all the distractions, all the worries, all the irritations are blocked out, and it's just us and God. It can become extremely easy to be distracted and lose sight of what we already have possession of. As we look out and see other people and see their situations, we forget about what God has already provided for us. We should be thinking, I can't wait to see what God does with what I already have. You need to practice shutting the door so that you and God can have some alone time, some one-on-one time daily. God desires to meet you daily, not just when you're desperate, not just when you have no other options. Because if you are shutting the door and spending time with God daily, it will begin to become muscle memory, so that when those crazy distractions come, it will be even easier in that moment to shut the door and focus on what God has for you. And so this mother here, she has closed the door. She's locked up in her house. She's witnessing God's power flow into her life in the form of oil. And verse 6, when the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not another. Then the oil stopped flowing. So the woman had been pouring and pouring and pouring, and the oil continued to flow out of that little pouring jar. I picture the sons as it's, the oil is just pouring out. It fills up one container, and the oil is pouring all over the floor. They're searching the house, trying to find another container, and then they're looking, and it comes down to the point where there's none left. There's nothing left. And they tell her, and as soon as those words come out of their mouth, that there is no more, the oil stops pouring out of that little jar. Don't you know, though, that entire time that the oil was flowing out of that jar, that there was excitement in the mom and in the sons that was almost palpable. As the oil is pouring out, they fill up one jar and start to pour into the next, and all of a sudden they begin to realize this thing is really happening. This little, 8 ounces of oil is just pouring out into every container that we have taken from all of our neighbors. They almost wanted to see how much God was able to do as they poured and as they poured. But that is almost the wrong thought process, because the miracle didn't stop at the lack of God's power. The miracle stopped because the woman was no longer able to contain what God could have done. God's amazing work in the life of the woman only extended as far as the amount of containers her faith prompted her to acquire. And how often is that true in the lives of us as individual Christians? God's working in us is limited by our own faith capacity. God's working in us is only limited by our own faith capacity. The mother saw God's power flowing in her life through something that she already possessed. But she was only able to experience a finite amount. Would that our prayer would become one of capacity expansion to see what God can do. Look at verse 7. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil, pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." So when the oil stopped flowing, she immediately went to Elisha and to tell him what happened. It's interesting to note, though, that what happened was exactly what Elisha told her would happen. So in effect, she's going and telling Elisha, "You were right the whole time. You know, we filled up all the jars all the way to the brim, just like you said we would do." God provided for this woman in an overwhelming fashion. Not only did she have enough to pay off the crippling debt that she had, but she would have enough money from the sale of that oil to live on for the rest of her life. She came to God asking for one thing, and he used something that he had already provided her for far more than she ever considered or even thought possible. God is the best gift giver. He is the ultimate DIYer. You bring your loaves and your fish, and he will give you enough food to feed a stadium full of people. You bring your little serving jar partially filled with oil, and he will provide enough money to take care of you for the rest of your life. See, even though this mother's capacity was limited, God's power working through her capacity was more than enough. We need to check our capacity. Check your faith capacity. How much faith do you have in your approach to God? There was he still is, a pastor in Dallas of a massive church in Dallas. I went to college at Dallas Baptist University, and his church is literally right next to the school. It's called the Potter's House. It's a huge church. The pastor's name is T.D. Jakes. Bishop T.D. Jakes is what he calls himself. A ministry that his church has is they produce movies. Sometimes they make them on their own. They fund movies. Most of them have Christian themes. Not all of them, but most of them do. And they put these out. And there was one time when they were in the beginning of this process of beginning this ministry of producing these Christian-themed movies. He had a meeting with an investment representative. He was going to ask this guy for some money to help fund this movie. And so they go to lunch, and T.D. Jakes is presenting how much money they're presenting, how much the project was going to cover. All the pieces that they were going to need to purchase, from the cameras to paying for certain different kinds of crew members, computers to do the editing on, how to do the distribution to get the movie out to the theaters. He finishes his presentation, and then he says how much they need. And he says, we need $200,000 to be able to do it right and get it out there so everyone can see. And that's all the way through to printing up all the DVDs we're going to need. That's everything. That will cover it all. And the guy finishes his bite, sets his napkin down, the investment rep, and he tells him, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to help you. He says, the group that I represent only start investing at $5 million. And so immediately the pastor begins to say, well, I can do so much more. We can get this and this. I was lowballing you. We can do so much more if we just had that. You see, he had entered the meeting with a limited faith capacity of what he was going to ask for. He had no idea the influence the man he was meeting with had. How often when we interact with God do we lowball what God can do? Do we enter into our time with God with a little bit of faith capacity. You see, when we allow our small faith to limit our capacity, we limit the power of God in our lives. God desires to fill our capacity to the brim, oftentimes using tools and giftedness that He has already given us. The struggle, though, often comes through a limited capacity because of our own lack of faith. You know, if you put yourself in this mother's position when Elisha told her to go out and get some vessels, get some containers, if you were in her position, what would you be thinking? How many containers would you get? Would you try to get just enough containers to cover the debt that was owed, or would you go out there and get everything you could possibly find so that every surface and floor space in your house was covered with a container, some kind of empty container? An expanded faith leads to a filled capacity, which means more than enough of God's provision. So we have to start by taking an inventory of our lives. Just say, what is in my pantry? What do I have already in my life? Because, you know, you have the ingredients. God provides His power, and it can do great things. But if you do not know God, then all you have is that small, empty pantry, that little jar of oil. You don't have access to the power of God. Jesus desires that every single person would know Him, even though He knows some will not. What it means to know Him, it means you believe that Jesus, God's Son, came, died, and rose from the dead. If you believe that, then you no longer are going to be bound for pain and punishment. You are going to get access to heaven with God forever. And so as you take inventory, you have to ask yourself, do I believe that? Do I know that? Not just know it in my head, but believe it, so it's a lifestyle decision. And so you believe that. As you take inventory of your life, you need to see that you do believe that, but you also need, as Jesus told us in Matthew 28, that you need to be baptized after you believe. That's key because baptism represents what happened in you when you believed. Going under the water represents dying to the way you used to live, dying to living for yourself. Coming out of the water represents getting a brand new life in Jesus, living for Him. And so that's why it's important to get baptized after you believe. So you take inventory of your life, you believe in Jesus, His death and resurrection, you get baptized, and then it is also key to become a member of a church, to become a participant in a church. Not just so you can attend every once in a while, but so that you can be used by God to further His purpose. That's why God had the church. That's why God introduced the church, to further His name and His glory. And we're supposed to use the gifts, the ingredients He has already given us, what He has put in our pantry to do His work His way. And if we're not doing that, we are failing Him. We are not using what He has given us to the full capacity in which He has intended it to be used. So we need to believe, we need to be baptized, and we need to become a member of God's church on purpose, not just on paper. And in a moment, we're going to have an invitation where I invite you to come and talk and pray with me. And if you want to make one of those three decisions, to believe, to be baptized, or to be an intentional member, even if you are already on our roll sheet in our computer, but you have not made an intentional decision to be used by God here at His church, come and we will take care of that today. So take inventory of your life. What has God already given you? But you also need to ask yourself, what do I need to shut the door on? What do I need to block out? What is distracting me from seeing what God has already been doing? But then you also need to check your capacity. Is your usability for God limited by your own faith?